The sixth rule of a meaningful life establishes a principle about agency and accountability. Your life is your responsibility. Not your parents' responsibility. Not your circumstances' responsibility. Not society's responsibility. Yours. The person who accepts full responsibility for their life, for their choices, their development, their direction, their results, gains power that the person blaming external factors never achieves. The person waiting for permission, for the right circumstances, for someone else to make their life happen wastes the life they have. This rule recognizes a fundamental gap between how people experience their lives and where actual power lies. Most people experience themselves as responding to circumstances. They blame their upbringing, their circumstances, their lack of opportunity, other people's actions for where they find themselves. This blame is sometimes justified. Circumstances do affect possibilities. But blame is also paralyzing. The person focused on who or what is responsible for their situation is not focused on what they can actually do about it. The principle operates through understanding that you control your responses even when you don't control circumstances. You may not control whether you were born into poverty or privilege. You may not control whether your parents were loving or absent. You may not control whether opportunities come to you. But you control how you respond to these circumstances. You control what effort you invest. You control what choices you make. You control whether you develop yourself or remain undeveloped. You control whether you take action or remain passive. Taking responsibility means recognizing that where you are now is partly a result of circumstances and partly a result of your choices. You may not be responsible for the hand you were dealt, but you are responsible for how you play the hand. The person taking responsibility asks, "What can I do about this?" The person blaming circumstances asks, "Why is this happening to me?" The question you ask determines whether you gain power or remain powerless. The rule also recognizes that responsibility is empowering. The person who blames external factors is at the mercy of external factors. They have no power because they're waiting for external factors to change. The person who takes responsibility for their life maintains power because they recognize that change comes through their own action. This shift from external locus of control to internal locus of control is transformative. The rule also recognizes that waiting for permission, for the perfect circumstances, for someone else to validate you is a form of abdication. You are waiting for someone else to take responsibility for your life. But nobody else will. Your parents cannot live your life for you. Society cannot make your life meaningful for you. Nobody else is responsible for making you happy, making you successful, making you fulfilled. You are. Successfully implementing this rule requires shifting from blame to agency, from waiting to acting, from victim mentality to ownership mentality. The first mechanism is identifying areas where you're blaming circumstances or other people instead of taking responsibility. Where are you telling yourself that if circumstances were different, you'd be different? Where are you telling yourself that if other people were different, you'd be successful? These are areas where you've abdicated responsibility. The second mechanism is examining what you actually control in these situations. You may not control circumstances, but you control your response. You control whether you develop skills that would help you succeed in different circumstances. You control whether you build relationships that would help you. You control whether you take action despite uncertainty or wait for perfect conditions. The third mechanism is distinguishing between responsibility and blame. Taking responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything. You're not responsible for being born into poverty. You're not responsible for having a difficult childhood. You're not responsible for things outside your control. But you are responsible for how you respond to these circumstances. You are responsible for what you do with the hand you were dealt. The fourth mechanism is moving from waiting for permission to acting without permission. Many people wait for someone to tell them they're allowed to pursue something. They wait for credentials, for validation, for someone to give them permission. But permission rarely comes. The person who acts without waiting for permission often accomplishes things. The person waiting for permission often accomplishes nothing. The fifth mechanism is understanding that taking responsibility means accepting failure as your responsibility too. You cannot take credit for success while blaming circumstances for failure. If you take responsibility for your life, you take responsibility for both outcomes. This means examining failures honestly to understand what you could do differently rather than looking for someone or something to blame. The sixth mechanism is recognizing that taking responsibility is different from doing everything alone. Taking responsibility doesn't mean never asking for help, never seeking mentorship, never accepting support. It means recognizing that ultimately your life is your responsibility, but you can and should leverage help, mentorship, and support in pursuing it. The seventh mechanism is developing the capacity to act despite uncertainty, despite fear, despite not knowing you'll succeed. The person waiting until they're certain they'll succeed often waits forever. The person acting despite uncertainty often discovers that action creates clarity that waiting never provides. Throughout history, figures who transformed their lives or made significant contributions often did so by taking responsibility for their circumstances rather than blaming them. One striking example comes from Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born enslaved, owned by another person, denied education, denied freedom. The circumstances were brutal and genuinely limiting. Yet Douglass took responsibility for his own education despite it being illegal. He taught himself to read and write. He took responsibility for his own freedom, escaping slavery. He took responsibility for his voice, becoming a powerful speaker and writer. Douglass had every justification for blaming circumstances. Instead, he took responsibility and transformed his life. Similarly, immigrant entrepreneurs often succeed not despite their circumstances but partly because they take responsibility for their situations. They may arrive in a new country with limited language skills, limited resources, limited connections. Rather than blaming these circumstances, they take responsibility for developing themselves and building their lives. This responsibility often drives them to accomplish more than those born into advantage. In athletic contexts, athletes who take responsibility for their performance often develop more than athletes blaming coaches, equipment, or circumstances. The athlete taking responsibility asks, "What can I do better?" The athlete blaming circumstances remains stuck. In business, entrepreneurs who take responsibility for their business's success and failure often build more successful businesses than entrepreneurs blaming markets, competition, or bad luck. Taking responsibility allows learning from failure. Blaming circumstances prevents learning. In personal relationships, people who take responsibility for their role in relationship problems often develop healthier relationships than people blaming partners for all problems. Taking responsibility allows change. Blaming prevents change. In contemporary career contexts, people who take responsibility for their career development often advance faster than those waiting for opportunities to come to them. The person asking, "What skills do I need to develop?" rather than "Why isn't anyone offering me better opportunities?" accomplishes more. In financial contexts, people who take responsibility for their financial situation often build more wealth than those blaming circumstances. The person asking, "What spending could I cut? What income could I increase?" rather than "Why am I poor?" takes action and changes their situation. In health and fitness contexts, people who take responsibility for their health often become healthier than those blaming genetics or circumstances. The person asking, "What habits could I change?" rather than "Why is it so hard for me?" develops better health. In creative pursuits, creators who take responsibility for their success rather than waiting for platforms, agents, or publishers often build larger audiences and more successful work. The person who starts creating without permission often accomplishes more than the person waiting for someone to discover them. In relationship contexts, people who take responsibility for relationship problems rather than blaming partners often develop stronger relationships. The person asking, "What could I do differently?" rather than "Why is my partner like this?" creates positive change. In education, students who take responsibility for their learning often learn more than students blaming teachers or circumstances. The student asked, "How can I learn this better?" rather than "Why is this so hard?" develops mastery. In personal development, people who take responsibility for their growth often develop faster than those waiting for others to teach them or circumstances to change. The person who reads, practices, and experiments often learns more than the person waiting for optimal conditions. The primary challenge in implementing this rule is accepting the enormity of responsibility. Once you recognize that your life is your responsibility, you cannot escape the weight of that responsibility. You cannot blame anyone else. You cannot wait for rescue. The comfort of blaming circumstances is replaced by the burden of responsibility. This is why many people resist taking responsibility. Blame offers comfort because it removes the burden. But it also removes power. The person who takes responsibility bears the weight but gains the power. The challenge also involves distinguishing between self-blame and healthy responsibility. Healthy responsibility means acknowledging your role and taking action to change. Unhealthy self-blame means judging yourself harshly and spiraling into shame. Taking responsibility is about moving forward, not about punishing yourself for past mistakes. The challenge also involves resisting the cultural narrative that tells you to blame circumstances or to wait for systemic change before you act. While systemic change matters, waiting for it while failing to take responsibility for what you can control wastes your life. Rule 6 might seem to advocate harsh judgment of yourself or others for circumstances outside their control. The resolution is understanding that taking responsibility doesn't mean judging harshly. It means recognizing what you can influence and focusing your effort there. With Rule 5 about embracing constraints, taking responsibility means recognizing constraints while taking responsibility for how you respond to them. With Rule 3 about integrity, taking responsibility includes being honest about your role in situations rather than creating false narratives that protect your ego. The sophisticated approach involves holding yourself accountable without judging yourself harshly, taking responsibility while also having compassion for the difficulty of the situation, recognizing constraints while refusing to use them as an excuse for inaction. Rule 6 establishes that your life is your responsibility. You control your responses, your effort, your development, your choices. The person taking responsibility for their life gains power that blame never provides. The person waiting for permission, for rescue, for circumstances to change wastes their life waiting. Master this rule by identifying where you blame circumstances or others instead of taking responsibility, by examining what you actually control, by taking action without waiting for permission, by treating failure as information rather than as excuse, and by recognizing that ultimately your life is your responsibility and nobody else will live it for you. The 6th rule of life, then, is really a rule about personal agency and power. Those who master it understand that responsibility is empowering, that blame is paralyzing, and that the person who takes responsibility for their life gains power to shape it. Take responsibility for your life, stop waiting for permission, and you'll discover that your agency matters far more than your circumstances.